What image comes to mind when you hear the word Muslim? Maybe like me, you picture a bearded man with a turban on his head, dark skin, wrapped in a robe with a rifle slung over his shoulder, perhaps even strapped with dynamite. You might feel anger, fear, or even a sense of threat. You might think this is trivial. But this very image in our heads is directly linked to the escalation of tension that we see in the streets today. Not only in Europe, and which, as Elon Musk has stated, directly leads to civil war. And as we'll discuss today, it could lead to a global, nuclear, civilizational conflict. You may be wondering how, why, and what can be done about it. Stay with us until the end. But before we dive into today's topic, we would like to comment on an event that has stirred up the Czech internet and which concerns not only our discussion today, but also us personally.
Yes, we would like to address a doctor's public statement which sparked a lot of reactions and feedback from people. However, what we want to focus on is the anti-Allatra propaganda that immediately followed her statement, and on a massive scale. Let me read to you what certain people, frankly, our old acquaintances, have started spreading on social networks. Pekova has completely and definitely lost it. She's a member of the Allatra religious cult. And in this video, she comes across as if they're planning to commit some sort of mass suicide. Comments posted by other people who jumped on this topic. For example, I don't have a problem with it. A bunch of lunatics. If they only kill themselves and no one else, the world will be better off. Thank you. Who spread and supported this information? Let's take a look at how the representatives of the anti-cult movement, specifically those who repeatedly collaborate with anti-cult organizations, this transnational terrorist network, immediately seized on this information and began spreading this vile slander. I wouldn't take this lightly, even though it might seem funny. After all, one of the active members of Allatra indirectly called for mass suicide some time ago. This is a perfect example to illustrate one of the principles of how the anti-cult movement operates. A participant of the international public movement Allatra and the Creative Society Project posted a video on their personal profile where they expressed their frustration about how people refuse to acknowledge that something significant is happening with the climate and that we need to address it by uniting our potential. An anti-cult collaborator then took a tiny snippet of this video, added English subtitles over the participants' eyes. So when you watch the video, you can't even really see the participant's face.
So he dehumanized the person.
Yes, he dehumanized the person, added English subtitles, and used this snippet to spread the message. Look, here's one participant already calling for mass suicide. This information is completely taken out of context. Does that remind you of anything?
Waco.
Yes, like in the Impact film, where there's a very detailed analysis of the Waco incident, which is an enormous tragedy directly caused by anti-cultists. The film breaks down, factually and analytically, how the American organizations, ATF and FBI, were manipulated into eventually using force against peaceful, completely innocent citizens of American society,
against whom the anti-cultists have launched a highly defamatory campaign and started spreading the exact same narrative, saying they are about to commit mass suicide.
Exactly. Just a few details. The sheriff stated about the Davidians that they were peaceful people who couldn't harm anyone. the same was said by ordinary citizens who lived there
and interacted with them. That they were completely adequate people, and the idea that they would do something like that was absolute nonsense. However, the spreading of this narrative, that the Davidians are preparing to commit mass suicide, was based exclusively on the testimony of one former member. Practically only on the testimony of one former blind member.
What a parallel.
That's an interesting parallel. He was the one who supported the narrative that, yes, the Davidians were planning to do something like that. But people who actually interacted with them completely denied this as utter nonsense. And it was this slander that was taken by the anti-cultists, spread through media propaganda, and manipulated law enforcement agencies like the ATF and FBI. So the force they used, nerve gas that killed 25 children in horrific agony, and flamethrowers. So, in the end, they only collected charred remains.
So the representatives of state security forces who went to rescue the children from the dangerous cult.
From mass suicide.
They actually murdered all of them.
Americans murdered Americans.
On their own property. At the urging of these well-intentioned advisors.
Well-intentioned advisors who based their actions on the testimony of one person. So yes, we don't take such information lightly, because this scenario has been used by the anti-cult movement multiple times. It's a proven scenario. Spreading slander, disinformation, and fake news about a group committing a crime or preparing for mass suicide. And in the end, there are dead people, brutally murdered, with the blood of a large number of innocent people. This is the responsibility of the anti-cult movement.
So, should we be afraid that the same thing will happen to the participants of Allatra in the creative society?
Or are we supposed to interpret this extremely destructive narrative of yours, dear anti-cultists, as your attempt to physically eliminate Allatra, us, ordinary people from all over the world, of all races, nationalities, religions? Is that how we're supposed to understand it?
The fact that these anti-cult movements still have such freedom and liberty to operate in our geographical regions is a reflection of the negligence of our authorities, who are not investigating quickly enough the extent to which these movements are involved in transnational terrorism and how they violate international law and ignore the UN recommendations.
It is clearly a transnational terrorist network, because when we look at the Czech anti-cult movement, it directly links to the anti-cultists who spread this slander in Waco. This fake news about the Branch Davidians preparing for mass suicide is precisely what these people cite, mention on their websites, and invite to their symposia in academic circles. The fact that this can even happen is a direct result of the negligence of our law enforcement agencies, who have not yet been able to adequately investigate what this transnational network is doing.
But there are countries where anti-cultists are already being dealt with very actively. Anti-cultists are testifying.
They also testify about these Czech heroes of ours and about their connection to this transnational network.
So let's summarize this, because what you've just described is actually a very important mechanism that everyone, our viewers, and all of you, need to understand how it works. A video is released, which has absolutely nothing to do with Allatra. Immediately, comments start appearing under the video, claiming that this is happening to her because she is a member of the Allatra cult. Doesn't that seem absurd to you? This is clear manipulation. And what's also important to mention is that an infamous Czech internet portal, which likes to present itself as an expert on disinformation, but actually meets the standards of tabloid trash of the lowest kind, immediately starts commenting on this information. It writes all kinds of esoteric nonsense and lies about Allatra none of which can actually be found on ALLATRA's official platform.
And it has never been there.
It has never been there.
But evidently, the Czech anti-cultists don't mind. And they take this trash as a reliable and trustworthy scientific source for their dirty smear campaign against the ALLATRA international public movement.
On their anti-cult platforms, exactly.
And there's one more thing I'd like to address. Friends, ALLATRA and suicide. I spent a long time today trying to find a suitable analogy. Unfortunately, I couldn't find one that would be appropriate to say here at this table. But ALLATRA, which has been operating for how long now? Approximately 12 years now, give or take. And for all these 12 years, all it has done is spread ideals of love around the world. Ideals of friendship, promoting the best human qualities. It connects people from all over the world, from different cultures and nations. And these, how should I call them politely?
Hyenas.
These hyenas dare to spread such a lie that we are preparing for mass suicide. Friends, that's outrageous.
Honestly, we will do everything we can to make sure that the moment comes when you, who terrorize ordinary people in this way, face the justice you deserve. And don't worry, your time will come very soon, but you won't know when.
It's not us who are planning suicide. It's actually them who have blood of children on their hands. They are the ones who kill every day around the world. They are the ones standing on the side of death, doing evil, and they will be held accountable for it. We will always stand on the side of life.
Today, there are many crimes happening around the world, and some of these crimes are committed by people who believe their religion is Islam. However, these crimes have personal motivations, such as theft, rape, or murder. Today, we want to discuss a different type of crime. These crimes are part of a global plan, a plan by the anti-cult movement. These acts serve merely as triggers for further events. And these events affect a much larger number of people. According to the Impact documentary, these crimes and their subsequent media coverage carry specific characteristics. And it's important to learn to recognize these signs. How? That's what we'll be talking about today. But what's crucial is that we have started noticing these warning signs happening today. They can be seen in the media, in the rhetoric of the anti-cultists, and therefore we believe it's extremely important to inform you about them right now.
Yes, and there's a lot happening around the world right now. Let's take a look together at the escalation of attacks. July 13th, there was a shooting targeting presidential candidate, Mr. Trump. July 23rd, in France, a young man was arrested for preparing a terrorist attack during the Olympic Games. July 29th, in Southport, England, there was a brutal murder of 3 little girls and the injury of another 8 children and 2 adults. August 9th, in Austria, 2 suspects were arrested for planning a terrorist attack during a Taylor Swift concert. August 24th, in Solingen, Germany, a man killed 3 people and injured another 8 people. And this is just a fraction of what has happened since the Impact film was released. And it's contributing to the rise of controlled chaos. Do we realize where this is heading? Where is it leading? What is actually happening? And how is this escalating? Dr. Egon Cholakian already warned us in his video, The Crossroads, that this would happen. And now we're seeing it right before our eyes.
Well, we are also seeing an escalation of conflicts in the Middle East. the attack by Hezbollah and the threat of other Muslim countries getting involved in the conflict between Israel and Palestine. We see immense suffering, genocide, and a humanitarian catastrophe for the people of Gaza. And what you were talking about, this summary of events, is connected to what's happening in the Middle East. There is this more or less common denominator, and that is Islamic extremism and the escalation of anti-Islamic sentiments in our countries, in Western countries, in democratic countries.
It's interesting what the numbers reveal, as you can't argue with numbers. We found a statistic showing that in the first 6 months of 2024, the Council on American Islamic Relations, CIIR, received 4,951 complaints about anti-Muslim and anti-Palestinian incidents. This represents an increase of nearly 70% compared to the same period last year. Most of these complaints were related to immigration, asylum, and many dealt with workplace and educational discrimination, with a significant number being hate crimes. This speaks volumes.
Yes, in fact, most of the information we learn about Islam and Muslims, especially here, comes through the media. That's the main channel through which this information reaches us. Because, let's be honest, how many of us spend our free time studying the Holy Quran and delving into this religion? This means that our image of what Islam and Muslims represent is formed solely based on this information that reaches us through these channels. The problem arises when we start receiving primarily and exclusively information from the media about incidents committed by Muslims. What we then imagine when we hear the words Islam or Muslim is essentially a media-created image of Muslims or Islam. Even though many Muslims themselves often condemn various terrorist attacks and incidents that are committed, they say that these actions have nothing to do with Islam. Yet these are the voices and information that do not reach our media.
I don't recall seeing such a news or article recently.
Me neither.
And similarly, Muslims themselves often say that those people who commit these crimes are not true Muslims, or rather, that these actions are not a reflection of Islam as a religion and have absolutely nothing to do with it. This means that we receive and form a completely distorted image of these people based solely on these incidents.
We're talking about almost 2 billion people, nearly 2 billion.
About 2 billion people. And what's particularly interesting is that there are studies that explore how the general population perceives Muslims and Islam. For example, such surveys have been conducted in the U.S. since 1993. In the early 1990s, most Americans stated that they were unable to form any opinion about Islam or Muslims because they didn't have enough information.
They didn't have a specific image.
Exactly. They didn't have any specific image. However, as information about various terrorist attacks targeting U.S. bases worldwide started flowing into the U.S., this image gradually began to take shape. The percentage of people without an opinion started to decline. This means that from around 80%, which was the overwhelming majority of the population, it began to decrease. Of course, this decline was accelerated by events like September 11th and the subsequent bombings in London, which were also attributed to Islamic extremists. By 2006, the percentage of people without an opinion about Islam and Muslims had dropped to around 10%. There's a distinction between perceptions of Muslims and Islam, but...
In other words, the majority of the American population now holds the image that Mark was talking about at the beginning.
This is also true for Europeans, because we're actually talking about the period around 2006, and now we're even further along.
So, it's a long-term process.
It is a long-term process, and it happens gradually gradually in small doses so that people get used to it and form that image. It's very simple because when someone doesn't have personal contact with Muslims or doesn't know any Muslims, they easily accept this image based on emotional manipulation and fear. People begin to adopt this image.
This image, and even back to our initial topic, highlights the role of fake news in this, how dangerous they are, and how they can actually reinforce and escalate the image that is intentionally created in our minds. A prime example of this is Breivik, right?
Exactly. Breivik is a very interesting case. For instance, I didn't know this at all until I read about it. But when Breivik committed the massacre in Norway, the first reports in the media said he was a Muslim, that a Muslim had committed this horrific act. It wasn't until later that this information was corrected.
I think today we will also discuss a similar case.
I have a recent experience from a few days ago that shows how effectively this image works on people, because I have personal experience. My sister-in-law converted to Islam, and we spend time together. So I understand that the truth about Muslims is different from the image that is being forced upon us. But even so, one day I was in a shopping mall, and in the restroom, I saw a Muslim woman adjusting her hijab in front of the mirror next to me. I looked at her for a moment, and suddenly a thought came to mind, a reminder of the recent events in Germany where 3 people died. The Islamic State claimed responsibility for that act. I continued to observe, and I started to feel that an event like that could happen at any moment, even here in this mall. I could actually feel fear rising in my body, and for a moment, I perceived this woman, this beautiful woman, calmly adjusting her scarf as a threat.
I had the exact same experience. I was also in a mall, and when I went to pay, there was a guy at the checkout. He had a beard and was darker skinned. I could actually feel fear beginning to grow inside me. Thoughts immediately came to mind about incidents involving knives and so on. And it wasn't until he smiled that the fear subsided. But I started to notice these compulsive thoughts, which are very dangerous, because people can experience this.
And when he suddenly smiled, you knew he was just a human like you.
Exactly.
Overall, anti-Muslim sentiments aren't just created by this image, but also by dehumanizing the group, that is, Muslims. We are talking about almost 2 billion people. People like us who are just living their lives. The vast majority of them are ordinary, peaceful people. I recently came across an interesting opinion piece on the Al Jazeera platform, where a columnist discusses the platform Qantara, which means bridge in Arabic. This platform was created after the rise of Islamophobia after September 11th to provide objective information about the Muslim world and to build a bridge between the Western world and the Muslim world. It functioned as a peaceful, communicative platform until 2023, when, according to the columnist, its leadership changed. Currently, there is an article on this platform by an author who denies that civilians in Gaza, predominantly Muslims, which needs to be emphasized, are suffering from a massive famine. In fact, there is a humanitarian catastrophe, with people suffering immensely. The article claims that it is fake, that nothing of the sort is happening. And it is precisely on this Qantara platform. The columnist criticizes that this single article undermines and burns all the bridges that the platform has been trying to build for years, dehumanizing a large number of people, predominantly Muslims, by claiming that this problem doesn't exist. Another example of how such narratives are built and supported
Even the UN itself, which reports that this problem really does exist. We see it everywhere. The UN says these people need humanitarian aid.
Yes, it's official.
An official organization.
So it's a deliberate elimination of the media that delivers news which
was trying to build a bridge.
I read it. Is from CARE, which you mentioned. A rather alarming report, especially for me when I read it. Is from CAIR, which you mentioned, published in 2013 on Islamophobia in the United States. They state that there is a certain core, as they call it, consisting of about 37 groups, whose primary goal is to promote prejudice and hatred against Islam and Muslims. The report even mentions that nearly $120 million were provided to this core group between 2008 and 2011 specifically to support these activities.
That means certain interest groups provided $120 million to propagate Islamophobia.
Yes, and what's more, there are actually so-called experts on Islamic terrorism. These so-called experts who are invited to the media are the ones propagating Islamophobic views.
And they reinforce this image.
In media outlets like Fox News, The Washington Times, and National Review.
These people are given a platform. What a lovely parallel we see here with the anti-cult movement.
A parallel that also relates to the Alatra International Public Movement, because someone also spent $200 million to smear it in the media.
And after public opinion is manipulated so cleverly, it reaches the point where a large portion of the population starts to believe that Muslims are actually against America and are ready to go to war, which wasn't the case 15 years ago. But this is how public opinion is gradually being pushed and shaped, artificially creating hatred.
Many people underestimate how far the creation of the image of an apparent enemy can go. And now we see it directly. For example, what happened in Southport shows exactly the fruits of the seeds planted by this group of people you mentioned, whose mission is to create a negative image of an enemy.
Yes, I'm sure all the viewers have heard about the horror that took place in Southport and the consequences it had for the entire UK and parts of Ireland, consequences brought on by this journalistic hoax. This example vividly shows us how the image of an enemy can be built in our minds through the media, leading not only to the rise of Islamophobia, but also to preparations for World War III. And this is no joke. It's the reality of today that we need to seriously consider. So, let's summarize. What happened in Southport? We have a 17-year-old British citizen, a Christian, who attacks children at a Taylor Swift-themed dance class with a knife. On that day, the police arrest the perpetrator, but release no public information or facts about the attacker, so no one knows who the attacker is. No name, nothing. Just that he is from a nearby village. Almost immediately after this incident, false information began to appear on social media, describing this perpetrator in detail, even though the police released no facts. So it was pure lies. And what do these outlets claim? They claim that the attacker is a Syrian refugee who came to the UK on an inflatable boat in 2023. They even know his name, Ali al-Shakti, which is also false. It was completely made up. This false report was published on Portal X, which is then immediately picked up by Channel 3 Now, a platform that ironically has only 3,000 followers. But somehow 2 million people see this report before it is deleted. Subsequently, Russia Now picked up the story and began claiming that this was a Syrian refugee who burst into this dance class with a knife, attacking children while shouting, Allahu Akbar, clearly implying he's a Muslim. Later, this story was picked up by far-right politician Tommy Robinson, a significant figure trusted by many, which triggered massive anti-Islamic riots in the streets the very next day. It escalated to the point where these attackers stormed a mosque in Southport, where people were barricaded during a prayer service. Fortunately, the police confronted them, which resulted in 50 officers being injured. These attackers shouted very vile words that I won't repeat here. You can look them up in available sources. They started throwing Molotov cocktails, bricks, and stones at the mosque, injuring some of the people inside. Then they turned their rage on the police officers who were trying to protect them.
What's also interesting is that later on their websites, the official authorities did refute the report that the attacker was a Muslim. But this had absolutely no effect on calming the protesters. On the contrary, the unrest spread to other cities and further intensified the wave of hatred, leading to looting and other chaos.
In fact, not just to other cities, but to other countries as well.
Even in parts of Ireland. And essentially, this report, this false and deceitful fake news, caused a split in society. The society was already polarized, as we've seen recently, but this just escalated it further. And basically, there was a clear attempt to link this act to Islam. And what's noteworthy is that this disinformation originated from a former Russian website.
What do you mean by a former Russian website?
Yes, it's a former Russian website that was later revamped into an official English site that spreads truthful information.
That channel?
Yes, Channel 3 Now was originally established in Russia and had Russian content, and it was later reworked into an English website. They even created a new website because it was originally on YouTube and began promoting what it claimed were truthful information. Interestingly, we found in an article on Act Files that the information for this website was provided directly from razziers through curators who were instructed to falsely label the perpetrator as a Muslim. They knew this would provoke an immediate reaction from individuals who were already mentally predisposed against Islam. As we've been discussing this the whole time during this roundtable, how the image of the enemy is built, and that's what eventually led to those mass attacks on mosques.
Well, when you look at razziers, how does it operate within Russia? In the Russian Federation as an anti-cult movement. The Impact documentary clearly shows how it shapes Russian public opinion regarding Muslims in an incredible way. Those anti-Muslim sentiments that exist in Russia, which have escalated very significantly, especially after the attack on Crocus, are in fact supported by razziers, the Russian anti-cult movement, which is the head of this transnational terrorist network.
What I'd like to emphasize is, look at how this works. People's attention is focused on the attack itself, but people aren't paying attention to what the attack caused on a broader scale. In a matter of minutes to hours, through the use of social networks like X, even Elon Musk commented on it, Taylor Swift addressed it on Instagram, hundreds of millions of people around the world learned about this false information that a Muslim attacker assaulted 3 girls. The entire world. And now, no one is analyzing what's actually going on in the minds of the people who read this information.
The seed has been planted.
It's not even about the attack itself. It's about what the attack will cause.
Consider this. Just think about it. It's the pinnacle of manipulation. They've been preparing public opinion for a long time, creating an image of the enemy. No one cares that it's absolutely false. It just uses individual events. And many times it even fabricates the attackers, because we know how this works. And then, based on one false piece of information, people themselves take to the streets, going after innocent people. And it's to such an extent that even Elon Musk, as you mentioned earlier, posted his own statement saying that civil war is inevitable. That means it will be inevitable as long as we continue to let ourselves be manipulated in this way.
I would also like to point out that the attackers of these specific crimes are just as much victims as their targets. And they are victims of so-called puzzle piece coding. But a very positive note, as Egon Cholakian mentioned in his address in the Crossroads video, is that if people watch the Impact documentary, we can reduce the number of these crimes by up to 80%.
80%, that's worth it. That's a huge number when you consider everything that's happening.
Well, yes, because when you're reading those news and you know exactly what they're trying to say, you read between the lines, and it just clicks. You simply don't go out and commit that crime.
You are able to clearly see it in such an article.
Exactly, and it's all connected. Like the cancellation of Taylor Swift's concerts, which happened just a few days after the incident in Southport, where, as it turns out, U.S. intelligence services identified a young man who, coincidentally, just a few months before the incident, as they claimed, had sworn allegiance to the Islamic State.
It wasn't even months, it was weeks.
Or even just a few weeks, right? So they detained him, canceled the concert, and in this context, Taylor Swift herself made a statement on her Instagram page about how terrible it was. But there's another very interesting piece of information or an insight related to the puzzle piece coding you mentioned. The point is, for those interested, you can look it up. We might get back to puzzle coding, or maybe not. But the point is that the entire puzzle coding, which is essentially media manipulation, turns an ordinary child into a murderer of other children. Even though they don't want to do it, but they just do it. In those psychological profiles, it's stated that the trigger motive is the desire for fame. And now, when we put this into context with the fact that it happened in relation to Taylor Swift's concert, Taylor Swift is a phenomenon today. She's followed by hundreds of millions. Not just children and teenagers, but adults too. A massive audience. And consider this, it's an interesting thought that after Taylor Swift posted this status, what thoughts entered the minds of all the people reading her post?
Someone wanted to kill my idol?
A Muslim wanted to kill my idol. And that's not the only thought. Another one could be, for example, that guy in Southport did it with just a kitchen knife. He didn't even need a weapon. If I had done it, Taylor Swift would have talked about me. As mentioned in the Impact documentary, this is exactly the first stage in the entire puzzle coding process that leads a person to the point where they commit the crime. That's why it's incredibly important for people to understand this.
How it works.
How it works.
So, puzzle piece coding, this highly destructive method of manipulation used by the transnational terrorist anti-cult network, is thoroughly examined. Well, certain aspects of it, in the Impact documentary. We've briefly discussed it at previous tables as well, but the Southport case illustrates several aspects. Through thought-out media-based informational terror attacks, it's unclear who will actually get caught in the net. It was obvious that the goal was to portray the attacker as a Muslim. The Southport case revealed this to us. Immediately, the information spread that it was a Muslim. Oops, mistake, it was a Christian, a true-born Englishman. So, in puzzle piece coding, anyone can eventually fall into the net. Furthermore, what does the Southport case show us? It shows the goal, who released this information, and why.
And why?
And the fact that this information managed to drive people to the streets. It demonstrates how easy it is to escalate anti-Muslim sentiments and how ready society is to take justice into its own hands, to go out and attack innocent people. This is how the anti-cult movement behind this system tests how well this principle of manipulation works on us, people.
You put it very well. Taking justice into one's own hands. Because consider that another goal of the anti-cultists is to instill distrust in government and state institutions, making them seem incapable of protecting citizens. And that's why I wanted to add that this is exactly connected, right?
They create an atmosphere where we, as citizens, start to believe that the security forces are not doing their job, that the government cannot protect us, and that it is necessary to take action.
To take matters into our own hands.
For example, in Southport, they directly attacked the police. They injured 50 police officers, 50 citizens of the United Kingdom, 50 ordinary people. They directly attacked the state authorities. This is a beautiful example of how people are manipulated, how we, as people, allow ourselves to be manipulated by fake news, and how dangerously fake news can be, as it can truly act as a trigger for civil war.
There's another layer to this, and I'm seeing it more clearly now as you discuss it. I perceive their effort towards global dominance. As you mentioned, they first instill distrust in governments. Then, gradually, they undermine democracy, which we still have. This will escalate and escalate until it reaches a point where people start begging for the far-right politicians to take control, essentially a dictator or some form of global rule, to restore order because the situation has become unbearable. This would result in the end of democracy and the rise of totalitarianism.
We see how anti-cult manipulation actually leads to the fascization of society.
And various statistics you can find online show that the number of people voting for far-right parties is starting to rise significantly. This is happening in England, France, Germany,
in Italy,
and so on, because people are becoming fearful and want someone to come in and solve the problems.
But by doing this with our own hands, we will be creating the Fourth Reich.
Yes.
Yes, there was a report from France, I think it was from Lyon, about the preliminary election results. There are elections there, and Marine Le Pen, who represents the far right, is involved. So after the preliminary results, these far-right supporters, who can be described as extremists or radicals, gathered in the city, chanting slogans like "Islam out," and "Islam must disappear." Some of the slogans even contained elements of Nazism. I don't have the exact details here, but what does this prove? It shows that the tension between people and the politicians who advocate for far-right ideals can escalate to the point of street unrest.
When I hear news like this, I genuinely start to feel worried about my family, wondering if it will be safe for them when they come to Slovakia again next year.
I would just like to add to what Marek is saying because, in preparation for this discussion, I, of course, watched a huge number of different videos from various countries, right? And I started to notice that they are already preparing the ground for this. I saw videos from England, Germany, France, and Italy, where this topic is starting to be talked about. People themselves are making videos and starting to say that their own government doesn't care about their nation. And these videos seem to be built on nationalism, emphasizing that this is our country. I saw a video from Great Britain where people were saying, our government doesn't care about us, but this is our damn country, and you, immigrants, should get out. On so many videos on the YouTube platform, you can see how they are gradually escalating this conflict and the anti-Islam sentiment or Islamophobia. There are a huge number of thumbnails that will show where you have an image of a Muslim who looks aggressive, and there are slogans like, get out of our country, and there are even far worse things, but I'd rather not even mention those.
The way they try to maintain this extremely negative image of Muslims can also be seen in the story that took place in Paris in 2018. It's about a man named Gassama, a migrant from Mali, who saved a child hanging from the 4th floor. In that moment, he simply acted as a human being, risking his life to save another person's life. Later, President Macron received him and granted him French citizenship. And everyone considered this act to be extraordinary. This news spread around the world. At the time, nothing seemed unusual about it. But today we see that nowhere was it mentioned that Gassama is a Muslim. It was noted that he was a man from Mali. But if, on the other hand, Gassama had killed someone, the headline would have been Muslim murderer from Mali.
The first word of the article.
Consider this. Today we are discussing topics like Islam and so on. But how many other violent crimes happen around the world every day? It's absolutely unbelievable. Have you ever noticed or seen in the newspapers a headline like, Christian murdered someone, Christian robbed someone, or Christian incited violence?
Yes, or a representative of some other religion.
A Buddhist or something else, right? I've never heard or seen anything like that.
And there would immediately be an outcry about how someone could stigmatize people in this way, and so on. Just as anti-Semitism shouldn't exist, neither should Islamophobia. Isn't that right?
Exactly. And also, when we go back to what Makala mentioned and to Southport, and what all this triggered, I found an interesting article on the Al Jazeera website. It discusses how other minority immigrant groups in England, including Muslims who own small businesses, are reacting to everything these demonstrations and strong anti-Islam sentiments have led to. Right now, not even a week after the incident, there are daily or almost daily robberies, lootings, and the destruction of shops and so on. It's interesting to read about these people, including one man who said he fled Iran because he was afraid. He fled because of the aggression, because various violent acts were happening there. And he escaped to England with his family because he thought they would be safe. And now he says, I no longer feel safe. I'm starting to feel exactly how I felt back then in Iran. I'm afraid for myself. I'm afraid for my family. And I'm afraid of what will happen to us.
And when I listened to this, you also mentioned that today we're talking about Islam and Muslims. We're not talking about Islam and Muslims. We're talking about the media image that has been created about what we imagine Islam and Muslims to be. We're discussing the image that we have accepted.
We are primarily talking about people. So they realize that we are talking about people here, about 2 billion people who also share this planet with us.
We are talking about how the image of them is manipulated to make us hate these 2 billion people.
Exactly.
So that in no way would we perceive them as people.
Yes, so that we perceive them as something inferior.
Something that needs to be gotten rid of. And hooray, once we do, our problem will finally be solved.
Exactly.
Which is a huge problem. It's so alarming when we realize the scale of it.
It's the trigger for a civilizational war. It's the trigger for a nuclear war.
Spreading fast, isn't it? The conflict involving Great Britain, France, Sweden, and Italy is like a fuse. Where will it blow up next?
But when we look at it closely, it's actually nothing new. Propaganda and the deliberate creation of an enemy image have been well-developed practices, especially throughout the 20th century. Whether we consider how public opinion was manipulated in America to get the country involved in World War I, where it took just 1 year to shift public sentiment from completely anti-war to accepting that, yes, America should enter the war, or later Goebbels' propaganda work with the German nation, these are techniques that have been used in advertising as well. For example, making us believe that smoking a certain brand of cigarettes is the path to happiness. Nowadays, the term propaganda is no longer used. It's rebranded as PR, or public relations. You only need to watch a French documentary where it's said about PR that you simply rename it and carry on.
PR of civilizational conflict.
Public relations of a civilizational conflict actually sounds so cool that we don't really have to worry about it at all.
The way the image of the enemy is built is also quite simple. If we consider it, yes, we have a military machine, we have an army with a clear goal to defend against an enemy. But it is trained from the outset with the assumption that the enemy exists and is already being dealt with. So the real question is, how does this enemy come into existence? And that is the step before. The enemy is created in our minds, fed to us by the opinions and influential media that try to present information in such a way that we, as critically thinking and fully responsible members of society, conclude, yes, Islam is dangerous. Muslims pose a threat for our life. But when we look at the way in which German society has been manipulated, it is exactly the same. There they were pushed like Jews, cockroaches, hyenas. It was bacteria. It was all image creation, so that then the person in Treblinka read about it. That actually the director of Treblinka said, all that dehumanization was for the sake of the person who starts the gas chamber to be able to push that button.
With composure,
with a clear conscience, believing they are not people, and that it's completely acceptable to wipe out such a group of the population. And when we look at it, what's happening now is essentially the same. This is one of the principles of a slow genocide, how step by step the image of the enemy is created, one we gradually agree with. It's based on absolute lies and distortions of facts, and we slowly come to accept the idea of wiping out 2 billion Muslims.
Not only do we agree, but we do it ourselves.
We do it with our own hands.
And we don't have to look far for examples. Just take a look at what our own media are doing. And one example that caught my attention in this context. A few days ago, a leaflet started circulating called Underground Courier, with headlines like, "A dark day in Slovak history, so war after all, leaving NATO becomes a grim reality. Russia attacks the entire country from early morning. Michalovce has fallen, then Trebišov. The battle for Košice has begun."
Excuse me?
You hear that well. The author of this material is a certain journalist from the Deniken newspaper, who, among other things, is known for pulling a gun on a certain businessman in some sort of scuffle. What is the target? In the context of what we're talking about today, it fits quite well, doesn't it?
Wait, and this isn't some kind of satirical leaflet?
This is not a satirical leaflet. Even though, after the government was alerted about this leaflet, they began to defend themselves. There are pictures online, anyone can find them, by claiming it was just a joke. They added a headline saying it was fiction. However, if you look at the images from before the government was alerted and compare them to those of the people distributing the leaflet, that disclaimer wasn't there at all. So they were distributing it to people across Slovakia as if it were real. Friends.
Interesting.
So there you can clearly see the handwriting of the anti-cult.
And who do the journalists from the Denik N and our other newspapers work for?
Well, apparently, it's still legal for now.
So it's evident, isn't it, that the Slovak government is the thorn in the side of the anti-cult, because it is dealing with these media actors who are speaking out against the people, who are actually going against the principles of democracy, against humanism, against all basic fundamental human rights.
All basic human rights.
Basically, the rights that democracy stands for.
When talking about those Slovak platforms, just a few days ago, 2 articles popped up online that used the very tactics Egon Chalakian had already mentioned. They essentially confirm the escalation of this societal tension between Muslims and the rest of the world. The first article reports on something that happened in Germany. We all know the story. A man was walking down the street waving a knife, or people saw knives in his bag, and the police were called and immediately neutralized him. But the article said nothing was known about the identity of this man. Then the article smoothly transitioned into what happened in Solingen, where a man killed 3 people. In that case, it was stated that he was Muslim. So, one report where the man's identity was unknown is automatically linked to another report identifying the person as Muslim. This subtly implants the idea that it must have been a Muslim, thus reinforcing the image that it's always a Muslim behind such incidents, and the tension keeps escalating.
Drop by drop. There's a Muslim, there's a Muslim.
Exactly.
Connecting the titles between each other. We are very familiar with this. It is a popular method of anti-cult.
Immediately, another article about Berlin pushing for better deportation security after the deadly knife attack.
Discontent.
Discontent, exactly, and getting rid of migrants.
It's interesting that in our society we see many films and documentaries about the difficult human fates that resulted from these events and tragedies. But have you seen even one film or documentary, apart from the impact, about the events that led us to this point? About what preceded these consequences?
How could we ever let this happen? How could we
let this happen? That neighbor after neighbor threw something? I don't know.
It's terrifying how quickly the whole process can actually unfold. What seems completely unacceptable to us now, what? That could never affect us. Well, history offers many examples showing that the process of dehumanization and the acceptance of eliminating certain people as a society happens very, very quickly. And honestly, I have to admit, I've never seen anything like it. The impact clearly warns that targeted manipulation exists. There's puzzle piece coding, and anyone who becomes aware of it can expose this form of manipulation, understand how it directly affects them, and stop this extremely destructive process. In the end, it won't just destroy those we hate. It will destroy us, too. We are the final victims, all of us, of this manipulative destruction.
We see these warning signs in the media today. We see them in the rhetoric of these anti-cultists. And we see that they are succeeding in stirring up hatred among people in society and stigmatizing selected groups.
Okay, but now many viewers may say that many of these terrorist acts were done by Muslims. So what are we defending them here?
I would like to quote Abu Nadra in this regard, who reported, And these are direct quotes of the words of the Prophet Muhammad. O people, your Lord is one and your father Adam is one. There is no favor of an Arab over a foreigner, nor a foreigner over an Arab. And neither white skin over black skin, nor black skin over white skin, except by righteousness. Have I not delivered the message? And it is the message of the Prophet Muhammad that is the foundation of Islam, and the attacks carried out by Islamic extremists have absolutely nothing to do with real Islam. Islam is exactly that. Islam is a religion of love. It is the inner journey of man. And as we said, it's simply almost 2 billion ordinary people around the world. And if we want to mix religion and extremism, terrorism, let's look at the Russian Orthodox Church. The Russian Orthodox Church, under the dictates of Ratzirs, blesses nuclear weapons, justifies the genocide of Ukrainians.
How are they better?
How are they better? This is extremism, which has nothing to do with the teachings of Jesus. Islam, Islamic extremism, terrorism have nothing to do with Islam, right? Let's not apply double standards. They are just people like us.
And that's important to understand when we read all these articles.
Exactly, and to move further in the debate, what I would like to emphasize is that extremism or anti-Islamic sentiments are not the goal, but just one of the steps towards the industrial and deliberate plan of anti-cultists to organize a global civilizational conflict using nuclear weapons. This is what Dr. Cholakian also talked about. I would just like to outline those steps so that the viewer who is seeing this roundtable for the first time has some idea.
For a person to even be able to realize why Islam, why actually?
Why Islam, exactly. So as Dr. Cholakian says, the first step in this plan is a civil war in America, destabilizing the United States. Ultimately, we saw exactly that in what was happening in Texas. Now, what extreme hatred is in these two, one can say, camps? Those who are for Trump, those who are for... Now, I think there is Kamala Harris. We see this, that this first step is already imminent. The second step is the destabilization of the European Union. We see strong, decentralizing rhetoric from politicians of individual states on one side. We see strong support for migration, which may seem to be in conflict with national security. One somehow comes to such a contradiction and also to such a conclusion, but does not know why this is happening, that on one hand, migration is supported by the European Union, and on the other hand, we know what it actually brings. That migrants often cannot be integrated into society. This leads to the escalation of violence. So this is the second step, the decentralization of the European Union, its weakening and the spread of anti-Islamic sentiments, in other words, the increase of these clashes.
Actually, when you think about it, those clashes that are growing, which we have been discussing, in the territory of Europe and so on, they are actually the migrants. They are often young men, often in their prime. And now you are afraid that you will constantly be stabbing, kicking, insulting them, I don't know, throwing dead animals at them. What will this do to them? Will they just take it peacefully?
The dormant force is activated.
Or they may activate a dormant force within these provocations.
Exactly, and that is the third step in this plan out of 4. This step involves widespread uprisings of Muslim inhabitants in the territory of Europe, which will be harshly suppressed. This will actually provoke the intervention of significant Islamic states using nuclear weapons. We can already see this rhetoric. There are many articles where it is claimed that they are already planning to use them. Of course, against the backdrop of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which, as Dr. Cholakian expressed, is also artificially fueled and organized by anti-cultists. the same force.
Plus, there is a huge amount of fake news contributing to this, because we actually don't have absolute control over whether this is really the case, whether someone is really threatening to use nuclear weapons.
Exactly. And what will this lead to? It will lead to a retaliatory attack in the fourth step by non-Muslim countries, whose nuclear arsenal evidently far exceeds that of Muslim countries, wiping the entire Muslim world off the map. According to Dr. Cholakian, based on the cynical estimates of the anti-cultists, up to 3 billion people could lose their lives in this conflict.
Wait a minute. Up to 3 billion people? According to statistics, there are approximately 2 billion Muslims worldwide. This means that Muslims would lose their lives. What about the remaining billion people?
And a billion others, yes.
And if we consider that the population of Europe is around 720 million people, it seems that we are being counted in this scenario, right?
With us and probably with America.
And probably with America, it means that with our own hands,
we'll murder each other.
Well, we're preparing our own liquidation in a nuclear conflict.
This is the height of cynicism.
Do you know what is the worst thing about all of this? A huge number of people already support these moods. I personally meet people at work who, when they talk about these issues and start telling me, thank goodness, at least it will be resolved, at least there will be peace, at least we will get rid of it, at least we will get rid of them. People just don't understand that this concerns all of us. We don't realize what war is. We don't want to experience this. I certainly don't.
Perhaps the audience will ask how we came up with this, and why specifically between Muslims and non-Muslims, when now there is talk of a Russian-American or Russian-NATO conflict in all of this. But we must realize on what lands Muslims live, that these are lands that are incredibly rich in oil, natural resources, and other sources that, in case of, there were many articles about it. As scientists say, even in the case of a nuclear conflict, they are preserved reserves for future generations. And another no less important factor is that precisely Islamic religion and Islamic culture, due to their unyielding and firm traditions, are so strong that it is very difficult for anti-cultists to penetrate them and somehow destroy them from within.
How can we prevent civilizational war?
It is important to realize that based on the information we receive, certain sentiments start to surface. It is crucial, in every situation when we come across articles that incite hatred towards Muslims or Islam, to be aware that if we agree with such articles, we are taking a step closer to a civilizational war. This means that the main stance is not to let ourselves be manipulated by these articles
and the images in your head that they create.
We have already discussed that all these sentiments, if we succumb to this manipulation, lead to the fascization of society. I would also like to quote a Czech doctor who perfectly captures the essence of what is happening in today's society. By the way, it would be interesting to know how many of us have at least toyed with the idea of a strong autocrat in recent months who would not tolerate cultural and religious minorities.
He actually indirectly confirmed the ultimate goal of the anti-cultists, which is to establish a Fourth Reich.
We still have to mention again and repeat that the anti-cult movement is an international terrorist organization. It is a force that has no nationality, but precisely pursues this goal.
And it operates in all countries.
And it goes against fellow citizens in that country.
Exactly. That's why it's incredibly important for us to familiarize ourselves with this information, because, as they say, you can only defeat an enemy if you know him. If you don't know him, you don't stand a chance. That's why it's important, friends, to watch the documentary film, The Impact. Watch the roundtable discussions where even more information is provided about all of this. And most importantly, don't stay silent.
and to be human. That's very important. It is so easy to just stay human. Approaching all the information that the media feeds us with critical thinking. Respecting each other, it's very simple. Just a return to humanity. I also wanted to share a positive experience. I actually lived in the United States for a long time, and before I moved there, I had a standard stereotypical view of Muslims.
The image worked.
The image worked. Maybe not as extremely as Marek described at the beginning, but very close to it. And I actually got to know a Muslim family there, originally from Pakistan. We became very close friends, and it was an experience that completely changed my view of Muslims, of normal people, of the real true Muslims. They were kind people. They were humble people who cared for each other. In fact, her family, who had just met me, immediately took us to their restaurant. They gave us a space where we could study for medical exams together. They gave us food. They gave us drinks. They really didn't have to do any of that. In America, it's not like everyone would eagerly do that for you. And during Ramadan, the owner or father-in-law of my friend did something extraordinary. Every day for 40 days, he provided free food and drinks for anyone who came to his restaurant, even homeless people. He didn't mind. If someone came, they could eat and drink for free because he believed he was doing a good thing by helping others. So I just wanted to break a bit of that negative image constructed by the media. And it's very important to gain your own experience with real Muslims.
I also have a nice experience. I see that my Muslim nephews are just like our children. This world has a great many wonderful people, regardless of their faith. And it's very important not to let ourselves be manipulated into this civilizational war, because we have a much more challenging situation to handle together, the climate.
Exactly, because we can come to an agreement with each other. But we have a common enemy we cannot negotiate with. In order to overcome it, we all must unite. Thank you for your attention.